A chime, a warning light, then silence. No engine roar, no background hum, just the quiet, impossible sound of a 132-ton airliner sliding through the sky with no power. At 41,000 feet over Canada, Air Canada Flight 143 had just become the world's heaviest glider. No one on board knew it yet, but the two men in the cockpit did, and one of them had spent years flying gliders for fun. Today, that hobby was the only reason anyone on that plane would walk away. This is the story of the pilot who landed a passenger jet with no engines, and how a simple math error turned a routine flight into one of the most unlikely saves in aviation history. It was July 23, 1983, Air Canada Flight 143, a brand new Boeing 767, flying from Montreal to Edmonton. 61 passengers, 8 crew. It should have been a quiet evening flight over the Canadian prairies. On paper, this was the future of aviation. Modern jets, glass cockpits, and a country transitioning from imperial units to metric. In reality, it was the perfect setup for a slow-motion disaster. Earlier that day, technicians had discovered a problem. The fuel quantity indicator system, the electronic gauges telling pilots how much fuel is on board, was malfunctioning. The quick fix: take fuel readings manually, using metal measuring sticks in the tanks, and then calculate the fuel by hand. That wasn't supposed to be a big deal. But there was a catch. The new Boeing 767 measured fuel in kilograms. The rest of Air Canada's fleet still used pounds. That meant one wrong conversion factor, one missed unit, and the numbers on the clipboard could look correct, while being dangerously wrong. When Captain Bob Pearson and First Officer Maurice Quintel took over Flight 143 in Montreal, the aircraft already had a history that day. The fuel system had acted up, and circuit breakers were pulled. On the ramp, ground crew and pilots worked out the fuel load together. They dipped the tanks, measured the fuel in liters, and converted that volume to mass. They calculated they needed 22,300 kilograms of fuel for the full route. Their math told them they had enough. In reality, they were carrying barely half. Somewhere in the chain, a number in pounds had been treated as kilograms. On paper, the fuel looked right. In the wings, it wasn't even close. Flight 143 left Montreal believing it had more than 20 tons of fuel. It climbed into the evening sky with only 10. For the first part of the flight, everything looked normal. The jet climbed smoothly, passengers settled in, and the cabin crew began service. Even in the cockpit, nothing seemed wrong. Modern jets don't have big mechanical fuel gauges. They have computers. Those computers were down, so the pilots relied on their calculations and a simple assumption: if there was a mistake, someone would have caught it by now. No one had. The aircraft made its short hop to Ottawa, landed, and then took off again toward Edmonton. Still no refuel, still trusting the numbers. Over central Canada, the first hint appeared: a fuel pressure warning on the left engine. It looked like a pump issue. Pumps fail sometimes, and engines can still draw fuel by gravity. The crew silenced the alarm and monitored the instruments. Then, the right side warning lit up. Both sides. Now it wasn't just a pump problem. As they began a descent toward Winnipeg, the left engine died. A jet engine doesn't explode when it starves. It just winds down. The sound fades, the power drops, the electrical systems strain, the cockpit went quiet. Pearson and Quintel prepared for a one-engine landing. Then, seconds later, they heard a sound no airline pilot had ever heard on that aircraft. All engines out. The second engine failed. The Boeing 767 lost all thrust. The cockpit screens went dark. At 41,000 feet, they were flying a dead airplane. Modern jets are not designed to glide for long with no power, but Boeing engineers had built in one last backup: a small propeller in the belly of the plane called a ram air turbine. As the jet moved through the air, this tiny prop spun like a windmill, generating just enough power for the most essential controls and basic instruments. No autopilot, no navigation screens, no fuel readouts, just altitude, airspeed, and attitude. Everything else would have to come from experience and judgment. Most airline pilots had never trained for all engines out on a 767. There was no checklist for it. Captain Pearson, however, had something unusual in his past. He was a glider pilot. He knew how to trade altitude for distance and time. The first decision: where do you go? Could they glide to Winnipeg? First Officer Quintel started running the numbers. In 10 nautical miles, they lost 5,000 feet. That meant a glide ratio of roughly 12 to 1. Good, but not good enough to reach Winnipeg. Quintal knew this region. He had trained at a former Royal Canadian Air Force base near a town called Gimli. He remembered its long runway. What he didn't know was that the base had been closed and converted into a motorsports park. On that evening, people were camping along the runway for a drag race. Pearson turned the crippled jet toward Gimli anyway. There was no other option. As they descended, new problems appeared. Without engine power, they had no normal flaps, no thrust reversers, and no way to go around if the approach looked wrong. They had one shot. The glide path to Gimli wasn't perfect. At first, it looked like they might come up short. Then, as they got closer, it looked like they might be too high. Too high in a powerless aircraft is just as dangerous as too low. You can't add power to stretch the approach. So Pearson did something he had practiced in gliders but almost no one had ever done in a wide-body jet. He put the 767 into a forward slip. He crossed the controls rudder one way, ailerons the other, exposing the side of the fuselage to the wind, dramatically increasing drag. Passengers felt the plane yaw sideways. It was uncomfortable, but it bled off altitude, fast. On the ground at Gimli, no one knew a jetliner was descending. Families were out with campers. Kids rode bikes along the old runway. A car race event was underway. In the cockpit, another problem. When they tried to lower the landing gear using gravity, the main gear locked down. The nose gear didn't. They were coming in with two main wheels and a nose that might collapse on contact. A powerless, heavy jet, a partially extended landing gear, and a runway that wasn't supposed to be active. The approach was silent. Without engines, the 767 made almost no noise. People on the ground looked up at the last second and saw something unreal. A full-size Air Canada jet, descending with no sound, aimed straight at their racetrack. In the cockpit, Pearson flared the aircraft, raising the nose to slow the descent. The main wheels slammed into the runway. Tires burst. The nose gear collapsed, and the front of the jet scraped along the concrete, throwing sparks. The aircraft slid, slowed, and finally stopped, just meters away from campers and spectators. There were injuries, but no fatalities. All 69 people on board survived. The Gimli Glider had just completed the most improbable glide in commercial aviation history. The miracle landing was only half the story. The other half was the investigation. The cause wasn't sabotage or a leak. It was a series of human and systemic errors stacked on top of each other. A faulty fuel sensor, a disabled backup, a new aircraft calibrated in kilograms, with ground crews still thinking in pounds. A single wrong conversion factor had quietly set the stage for an in-flight fuel exhaustion. The consequences were complicated. Captain Pearson was initially demoted, and First Officer Quintal was suspended. But as more details emerged, something else became clear. This was a systems failure. The fuel sensors were known to be unreliable. The documentation around metric conversion was confusing. The same investigation that criticized the crew also praised them for their calm, their coordination, and their airmanship. Years later, Pearson and Quintal received international recognition. Simulators would later show that most crews given the same scenario crashed. The aircraft itself, the Gimli Glider, was repaired and returned to service, flying passengers for another 25 years. In aviation, the story became legend. Training programs incorporated its lessons. Fuel checks became stricter, and emergency manuals evolved. A quiet emergency over Canada changed how airlines thought about fuel, units, and human skill. What makes this story so powerful is how it ended, not with a crater in a field, but with an unlikely glide, a silent approach, and passengers walking away from a plane that should have been impossible to land. The Gimli Glider is a story about how complex systems fail, and how human skill, improvisation, and experience can still matter when everything else goes dark. On July 23, 1983, a Boeing 767 ran out of fuel at 41,000 feet. It should have been the end. Instead, it became proof that even inside a machine designed by thousands, the judgment of one person at the controls can still decide whether a tragedy is written into history or whether it becomes a story of survival. Thank you for watching. If you found this story as incredible as I did, consider subscribing for more tales from the history of aviation.